Hello everyone, it's Seth, probably better known as Saffron, and we're back here today with another edition of Against the Odds. And I think this one is a pretty sweet one. We're playing a deck I'm calling Hardlock Helix. It's a modern deck. Not that it matters for the series, but it comes in at $473 in paper, $221 in line. So not super cheap, but it is super sweet. So last week, on our voting, we had 5 options. We had Helix Pinnacle, Retreats for Standard, Zada Hedron Grinder, Blightsteel Colossus, and Coin Flip for Legacy. When it was all said and done, it came down to a 2-card battle. It was Helix Pinnacle versus Retreats, and in the end, Helix Pinnacle squeaked it out just barely. It won by 20 votes out of nearly 4,000 votes. Coming in third is Zada Hedron Grinder. So Zada drops down a spot, usually comes in second, drop down to third. But don't worry, third place is still good enough to come back for the next poll. So Zada and Retreats will be on our next one. And then dropping off, Blightsteel Colossus and Coin Flips for Legacy. So another week where Legacy comes in last place. Sort of becoming a tradition. I guess you guys and girls just really don't like Legacy, apparently. Anyway, let's talk about this deck. Helix Pinnacle is a really crazy card. 1 mana green enchantment. It has Shroud, so it's really hard to deal with. And it has an ability where you can pay X and put X counters on Helix Pinnacle. Alright, pretty straightforward. If you get up to 100 tower counters, you win the game at the beginning of your upkeep. So the first thing that sticks out about Helix Pinnacle is 100 is a lot. In theory, that means you have to, over the course of the game, spend 100 mana on Helix Pinnacle. So when I was thinking about how to build Helix Pinnacle, a couple things came to mind. One idea was to play a rampy, maybe devotion-y deck, and try to make 15 or 20 mana per turn to speed up the Helix Pinnacle clock. Thing is, something I try to avoid on Against the Odds is just making a worse version of another deck, and I felt like if we're going to play Green Devotion or a green ramp strategy, the question would be, why don't you just cast an Emrakul? Or why don't you tooth and nail into Emrakul and Xenagos? These are actual decks. So I didn't want to just play Green Devotion and say, hey guys, I got Helix Pinnacle, isn't that cool? Yeah, hooray. That didn't seem right. The other option, which seemed like a really bad option, was to try to have some sort of infinite mana combo, where in one turn you would make all 100 mana, pour it into Helix Pinnacle, and win. So the thing is, why this is possible, there's Pili Pala with Grand Architect, and there's a couple weird infinite mana combos, and that doesn't seem that much about Helix Pinnacle either. That's what it came down to. In that situation, why wouldn't you just play a Blue Sun Zenith and make your opponent draw their entire library for 60 mana, or a Banefire to burn them out for 20 mana? If you have infinite mana, there's plenty of ways you can kill your opponent. So I really wanted to build a deck where Helix Pinnacle was actually the best card for its role in the deck. It was the best finisher for the deck. And that's what I tried to do. So we got a little wacky, but I think this is really a Helix Pinnacle deck, and I'm pretty proud of how it turned out. So Helix Pinnacle, obviously a 4 of, the namesake card. What we're trying to do is make it so we can't cast spells. Well, mostly our opponent can't cast spells, but sometimes we can't cast spells as well. So this is the combo. This is the hard lock. And I probably got to explain a little bit how this works. So, because it's confusing, you won't believe how many times people have to read these cards once you start casting them on Magic Online. So Rule of Law and Curse of Exhaustion, pretty much the same card. They're enchantments. One is 3 mana, one is 4 mana. They're both white, and they say that a player can't cast more than 1 spell each turn. The benefit of Curse is its target player. Curses enchant a player, so this would enchant our opponent and make it so our opponent can't cast more than 1 spell each turn. Rule of Law, on the other hand, symmetrical. It affects both of us. Neither one of us can cast more than 1 spell each turn. So you might be thinking, yeah, well, that kind of makes sense. If our opponent can only cast 1 spell, it slows them down and gives us more time to put counters on Helix Pinnacle. But it's actually more than that. The big payoff is Knowledge Pool. So Knowledge Pool is a 6 mana artifact. It has Imprint, When Knowledge Pool enters the battlefield, each player exiles the top 3 cards of his or her library. So there'll be a total of 6 cards under Knowledge Pool. And then it says whenever a player casts a spell from his or her hand, that player exiles it. If the player does, he or she may cast another non-land card exiled with Knowledge Pool without paying that card's mana cost. So basically, you cast a spell, exile that spell, and you get to cast one of the 6 cards exiled with Knowledge Pool. The thing is, with Cursive Exhaustion or Rule of Law on the battlefield, you can only cast one spell. So you cast a spell, it gets exiled, and you can't cast the spell under Knowledge Pool. So this is a hard lock. With Cursive Exhaustion and Knowledge Pool on the battlefield, it says our opponent cannot cast spells. That's the end of it. There is no getting around it. It's not that the spell's countered. It's not whatever. It is, the spell is exiled as soon as they cast it, then their turn ends. With the Rule of Law, you'll notice we only have one of those. That happens to both of us. So both players are hard locked out of the game. Neither one of us can play spells. So obviously Curse is preferable because we like to cast spells, but Rule of Law is just fine in this deck too, because if we have a Helix Pinnacle on the battlefield and the board is stable, we don't care. We cannot cast a spell, and we can just spend every turn pouring our mana into Helix, and we'll win the game eventually, even though neither one of us can cast spells. It's just absurd, but it's awesome. And Curse does the same thing. Since our opponent can never cast spells, we can put mana onto Helix for 5 or 10 or 20 turns in a row. 5 at a time, 7 at a time, 10 at a time, and eventually it'll get to 100 counters and we'll win the game. The rest of the deck is control cards, but they also they play off the your opponent can only cast one spell theme. So we have 4 paths, 3 condescends, 4 mana leaks, and 4 emans. So once we get a Rule of Law down, or we get a Cursive Exhaustion down, these spells become awesome because they become time walks, basically. Since our opponent can only cast one spell, and this is without Knowledge Pool, when our opponent isn't hard locked, but they're kind of soft locked to one spell a turn. If we know our opponent can only cast one spell each turn, and we can deal with that one spell, it skips our opponent's entire turn. So they go to cast their Tarmogoyf, we cast Remand, maybe they have 10 mana available. Normally they would just recast the Tarmogoyf, doesn't do anything. Instead, Remand makes them skip their entire turn. The opportunity cost of casting Tarmogoyf when we remand it is your turn is over, you can't cast another spell. Same thing for Mana Leak and Condescend. If we can counter the one spell that they play, they have to skip the whole rest of their turn. So these become time walk, literally. We pay 2 mana and take another turn. Our opponent's turn ends. Path to Exile, sort of the same thing. It is a way where if we don't have a counter spell, our opponent resolves something, we can just immediately path that. Our opponent can't counter back because they can only cast one spell, and we make them skip their entire turn for 1 mana. So these cards, and I mean, they're good on their own. Counters are also good on their own. They help us force through our other spells. They help protect us when we don't have our combo set up. So they're good anyway, but they're really good when your opponent can only cast one spell each turn. The last cards in the main deck, we have a single Detention Sphere. This is another kind of catch-all spell for something that slips through our lock and buys us more time to get our 100 tower counters on our Helix. But it can take out a Planeswalker. It's also really sweet because it can take out a whole horde of Lingering Souls tokens. And Supreme Verdict, super important, destroys all creatures. So one of the things about our lock is we really don't want to be behind on board when we put it off. Like, it is possible for us to play a Curse of Exhaustion on turn 4, play a Knowledge Pool on turn 6, and if things didn't go well the early turns of the game, our opponent can have so much on board that we could still lose, even though our opponent can't cast spells. This is especially true against a deck like Affinity or something like that can flood the board early. If they just have a ton of creatures, they don't care if they can't cast spells because they're going to win with the spells they already cast. Supreme Verdict is a way to clean up all those creatures and make sure that that board is empty when we get to the point of locking our opponent out of the game. Mana base wise, Stirring Wildwood, Celestial Colonnade. creature lands. They're pretty important because if we get to the situation where Rule of Law locks us out of the game and we can't cast spells, and God forbid we don't have a Helix Pinnacle on the battlefield, they are a way we can win the game. Eventually, when neither one of us can cast spells, we will draw a Celestial Colonnade or a Stirring Wildwood, which we can still play. Knowledge Pool doesn't keep you from playing lands, so that's fine, and then we can use those as creatures, so they're basically creatures that get around the hard lock of Knowledge Pool. And then obviously the fetch lands, 4 Windswept Heath, 4 Flooded Strand, best mana fixing lands in Modern, especially when you combine them with our 5 shock lands. So we got 2 Temple Gardens, 2 Hallowed Fountains, and a Breeding Pool. Ghost Quarter is another really important piece. Ghost Quarter, I was just telling you how manlands are really good through a hard lock because you can play them and attack with them even if you can't cast any spells. Well, Ghost Quarter is to make sure we don't get killed by our opponent's creature lands while they are under the hard lock. So it is possible, going back to Affinity, or let's use Jund as an example since we talked about Affinity. It's possible that we could lock our Jund opponent out of the game, have the board clear, and they draw multiple Raging Ravines or Treetop Villages, and could beat us down and kill us with those since they get around the lock. Ghost Quarter is a way to make sure that doesn't happen. Rest of the deck, sideboard-wise, we got a Dispel for control matchups, Negate, also for control matchups, Rest in Peace, deals with any graveyard problems we might run into, Stony Silence, shuts down Affinity, also pretty good against Tron and other egg-playing decks, Ghostly Prison, another way to slow down aggro decks. If we run into a go-wide aggro strategy, can shut down a whole bunch of Empty the Warrens tokens or Lingering Souls tokens. Crossing Grip, another way to deal with an artifact or enchantment. 2 Timely Reinforcements, part of our aggro package, comes in against Burn or Zoo, decks like that. Vendilion Click allows us to pressure our opponent on their turn, pressure their hand specifically. We're unlikely to win with the damage from Click, but it's a way to play it on our opponent's end step, force them to use their counter magic, or if they don't, we get to peek at their hand and see if the coast is clear for us to lock our opponent out with the Curse of Exhaustion or Knowledge Pool. Leyline of Sanctity helps us deal with discard, also pretty much GG's against burn decks, just because they cannot burn you out because they can't target you. And then the 4th Supreme Verdict comes in against any big creature-based matchups. We didn't want 4 in the main deck because it's really bad in non-creature matchups, and drawing too many of them is a good way to lose those games. But against decks that are trying to win primarily with creatures, having the 4th Supreme Verdict is pretty nice. So I don't know. I think this deck is really sweet. I really like the idea of it. As far as the odds, I mean, we're playing a 4-mana do-nothing enchantment, and it combos with a 6-mana do-nothing artifact. So it doesn't sound like the kind of thing that's competitive in Modern. But we do have a lot of counter spells. We do have a lot of removal. So we can kind of play the control role. And Helix Pinnacle is a guaranteed way to win the game. We don't have to worry about our manlands getting ghost quartered. We don't have to worry about being ahead on board. Like, if we can have a Helix Pinnacle out there when we put in the lock, it will win the game. And that's why I'm so excited about this deck, is this is a Helix Pinnacle deck. It's not a Green Devotion deck that we're playing a subpar finisher in Helix Pinnacle. It's not some other ramp deck where we could be playing Emrakul, but instead we're playing Helix Pinnacle. This deck is a Helix Pinnacle deck. If you look it over, Helix Pinnacle is a perfect card for this deck. So I'm super excited for it. That said, I'm going to say we win maybe 10% of the time. I just can't imagine that this is consistently a plan to win. We definitely can't win quickly by any stretch of the imagination. We make a blue-white-red control deck look like an aggro deck. That's how slow we are. But so I don't think we'll win that often, but if we win once, I will be thrilled because this is so sweet. Anyway, don't forget to check out mtggoldfish.com. That's where the article is for Hardlock Helix. That is also where the poll is for next week's Against the Odds deck. It's where all my articles are. Tons of other great articles and content by other content creators. Decks prices, the metagame, basically anything and everything you could want for Magic the Gathering. And if you like the video, sign up for the YouTube channel. It will keep you up to date on all the latest and greatest of video content from mtggoldfish.com. Anyway, thank you all for watching, and I will talk to you soon.